Today I'm going to present about, give an overview about participatory cities, because we have been talking about smart cities during this workshop, as well as we spoke about it last week as well. Want me to switch it on? Yeah. Yeah. So I would just like to continue the conversation, but looking at smart cities more from a participatory aspect, more from from a citizen's point of view, and also talk about stakeholders, which we have already discussed, but because it's such a massive term, if you think about stakeholders, because the way we can define it is different depending on different contexts. So if we start about it, let's look at the evolution of terms of stakeholders. So because I was inspired by people going into the definitions and how they come across. So I was looking at it, and I figured out that according to the English dictionary, the stakeholders, which can be simply understood as someone who holds the stakes. And in the previous times, I would say like before mid 20th century, it was used mainly in gambling. So for example, if two people are gambling, someone would give the stakes to a third person, totally not interested party, who is just a neutral. And the path for the stakeholder was to give the stakes to the winner. So it was very simple how it worked. But the time, and I would say the way in which the term has evolved, now stakeholder has got more meaning as it had in the earlier times. Now it's a group of individuals, different actors in the society who are affected by any decisions that are being made. And if you look at the earlier papers where they discussed about stakeholders, it was mainly from business perspective, where they would talk about like how important it is to include all the stakeholders when making a business decision in any kind of company or something. Still, to understand stakeholders, it takes more than just understanding the definition. And when it comes to smart city, I think it becomes more and more difficult. So let's see who the stakeholders are in the smart city ecosystem. And yeah, but the thing is, I don't want to go in the smart city concept like it has been discussed. So I want to take a more metaphorical way to look into that. So let's imagine a bustling beehive, and let's say this is our smart city. Now, who are our bees here? Like stakeholders. There are the worker bees, who are making the hive thrive, and they can be considered as the residents. Then we have the honey makers, who are sweetening the economic pot of the city, and they can be the local businesses. Then we have the queen bee, who is, like the government. We have the beekeepers, and in context of smart city, we can talk about, let's say, the technology companies who are making sure that the hive is functioning properly. Then we have the drones, who are often overlooked, but they are vital for the hive's diversity. And in the case of smart city, we can consider it as marginalized groups. I would also like to say this is a very opinionated approach to look at it. Maybe it can differ, but to present a different viewpoint on looking at it. And what I would say is, like, every bee here, like a stakeholder, it has its needs and interests. And while all the buzzing, it can be chaotic, there can be some loud buzzing, some silent, not so loud buzzing, but it's important to make sure that all those buzzes are heard if we really want to create a more inclusive and more participatory smart city. Now, when we actually look at the smart city and we try to understand what are the dynamics, that are there between stakeholders, there are different ways to analyze it. And if we look at it through let's say a simple example, so we have smart city, we have several stakeholders here. For example, we have the city government, which is mainly responsible for the decision making. Then we have the tech companies who have a lot of influence, because there's a saying that if you control the data, you really can control the decisions, especially when it comes to smart city. Then you have the citizens, who are a key aspect of smart city, but the influence is quite limited. Then you also have non-profit organizations who are working towards the betterment mostly, but they also have a limited influence. And how these influences affect the decision making also impacts how the smart city functions. So in most of the cases, as we have seen in several examples, there's a dominant influence of the city government and tech companies. and limited influence of the primary beneficiaries, which are the citizens, and that somehow results in very inequitable outcomes. Now, these scenarios are actually quite evident. If you see several examples, it's quite easy to understand how these power dynamics occur, and because of this, the smart city initiatives fail. So let's talk about some smart city examples, and I would start with the example of Project Greenlight. I don't know if you know about this, but this was a project which was started around 2016 in Detroit. And the idea was to have a real-time surveillance system to reduce crime. So if you think about it, the idea was quite good. They really wanted to do something for the city. However, there were concerns about the racial profiling, the algorithm bias, as well as how it was affecting the marginalized communities. And you would be shocked that even after all the negative aspects of this project came out, it is still in use. So at the moment, like in Michigan, people, when I say people, is mainly if you have a store or you have a gas station or something. Even if you want to monitor your neighborhood, you can pay around $100 to $200 as a subscription fee, and you have to have them installed. Paying maybe $2,000, $3,000 to have the whole setup. And there's also a priority service where you have a green light put right at those intersections. So it's like a bat signal. So it starts rotating, and you will have the police or someone come very quickly to you. There was this news about this thing that during the Black Lives Matter protest, they were actually using this project to find out like the people who were not doing social distancing, and then they were sharing the data with the, how do you call it, like the immigrant caucus, so that they could target the people who are breaking rules and find a way to actually I don't know, deport them or do something against them. So this is one of the smart city initiatives that did go wrong. Then the other smart city initiative is, I think everyone heard about it. It's the Sidewalks Lab in Toronto. So the idea, or like the vision was great. They really wanted to create like a smart city, which was aimed at building a data-driven neighborhood, but it faced backlash because of issues like data privacy, and eventually it was cancelled. And a lot of issues were actually related to that. Most of the people who were supposed to live in those neighborhoods, they had no idea how their data was being processed, who was in control of the data, what was being done with the data. And the ones who were not very tech savvy, they also had a lot of concerns. Then the other one is it's called the Link NYC kiosks in New York City. So it's also a very old project. It's still going on, and it started in also 2016 or 2015, where they decided to change all the public telephone booths with these Wi-Fi kiosks. So again, the idea was perfect. The initiative was to connect the city to have this free Wi-Fi for everyone. But the way they did it wrong was that they wanted to cover the whole city with almost 7,500 kiosks. And the idea was when someone logs into the system, they have to give away a lot of information, and they would store the information for 12 months. And they had this thing in their agreement where they mentioned that they are not going to remove it, like after 12 months, but they will still keep on saving the information just in case if there are tourists who go back. So they will have the information, so it will become more seamless for them to re-sign up for this service and use it. But again, there was a huge outcry about it, how people, and this was mainly about the homeless people who were just sitting there all day browsing internet. And then there was also a problem, people were watching porn there. So it got very heated, where the mayor was confronted by the local people that it's actually not good for the city because of a lot of other issues that were happening. So instead of taking action, they are still doing more deployment. And the company that is behind this is called City Bridge. They still plan to cover more parts of the city. So if you look at all these three examples, I'm sure there are a lot more of them, but one common thread among all these examples is that the idea behind the initiative might be very useful, or like the overall aim is good, but the side effects are also quite big. And one of the reasons why these projects fail is because the decisions were taken in a very top-down approach, and people were not consulted. The ones who were actually being affected were not consulted. And when we think about this, how can we make sure that in such cases where these projects are deployed citywide, people are also being part of that? One keyword that has been widely used in academic community is citizen science. I know you must be wondering, citizen science is usually about projects where researchers work with citizens, and like they create this small projects which are funded by small grants, and they try to pursue a project for the duration of the funding. They take a scientific question, they use the data that is generated by the citizens, and all good. Once the project is over, it moves on. But the way I see it is like, they are more than collecting data. So it's not just about, using citizens as data point, but also raising awareness, building capacity, as well as strengthening communities. Similarly, I feel smart cities encompass more than ICT, energy, or transport infrastructures. They should revolve around involvement of citizens in these projects, like day-to-day governance and how we can make life better of their fellow residents, as well as preserving the environment. Unfortunately, there has been a very little synergy between the citizen science methodology and the smart city initiatives because of several reasons. There are ethical reasons that are associated with this. There are technical challenges that are associated with this. And if you look at the key challenges, that are very evident and widely discussed, some of them are about data quality and validation. That when you ask a layman, or like to do some data monitoring, how do you make sure the quality is good and it's validated? Then the other cases, in most of these scenarios, if you want to do for long term, people lose interest. So how can you make sure that you can retain these people, and they actually participate with motivation and enthusiasm? Another challenge is scalability. Like, how can you make sure that even if you start from a neighborhood, you can scale it to city level or a district level, or things like that? And one more challenge is about accessibility of technology. Not everyone is used to using these devices or sensors or things. How can you make sure that people actually use them? But there are other ethical issues as well. For example, data privacy and security, where these citizens who are spending their time, they are giving you the data. Sometimes they don't even know what's happening with their data. What is going to happen after the project is finished? So this raises concerns about, rights, like what are the data rights of these people? Then the consent, because most of the times in these projects, when citizens are usually treated as data sources, they don't know, like what else can be done in these projects from the point of view of citizens, because they have a lot of knowledge to share. They have the contextual understanding, which is probably missing when, for example, I'm an engineer. If I'm looking at a problem, maybe I can create something for someone, but these intricate details, which are very important to understand the context, might not be very clear to me. And that is where the input from the citizens is must. Then there's a digital divide. Some people, can use digital tools very easily. They can also influence others using these tools, but some of them, they are not well versed with it. And the final ethical issue is about inclusivity and representation, because I've realized this thing, and probably everyone can resonate, with this idea that when a project sometimes is being funded, there are different motivations, and there are different ambitions, because you have to please the funding body, you have to please the university, you have to make sure you get a paper out of it, which pleases the journal as well. So the idea is to get the best set of people who can get you the best response or the best data, and then you continue that. And in those cases, sometimes what happens is we lose track of who we are including. Are we really getting the people or the stakeholders are actually being affected or not? And these are some things which have been researched over the times, but still there's a lot of room for improvement. And in citizen science projects, there are different categories now where people are actually looking at how we can make sure that these projects tackle these challenges. So there are these contributory projects, which are like the conventional citizen science projects, which are designed by professional researchers, and members of public are primarily contributing data. Then there are these collaborative projects where citizens provide data and may participate in analysis or communication of the results. And there's this third category, which is called the co-created projects, where researchers and citizens, they work really close since the initiation of the project till the end of the project, and they are involved in totally all the phases. And this is more like a description of what are the roles. This is also very context-based, like different projects can have different roles for different citizens, but I would like here to focus on the co-created one, where the citizens are usually involved since the beginning. They are also discussing the research problem in a way where, so the scientists, or let's say the decision makers, don't go to them and tell them, okay, this is the problem and let's solve this. But it's rather more like a collaborative effort where everyone sits together, they pitch in their interests, they pitch in the problems they're facing. There is a way to empathize with each other, to understand, like to put each other's, like to put someone in someone else's shoes to understand what's the problem, and then go ahead with finding what are the relevant strategies to actually tackle the problem, as well as design methods, as well as methodologies, and disseminate those results. Now, on paper, this all sounds really nice. It sounds very good that, okay, there are ways to involve the community and there are ways to actually do things. But there's always this question, does it actually work in real life? And there are actually several examples which can show that they can work. There's a potential if the things are done right. And I would like to share with you one project that I was involved earlier, and it's about the air quality issues in Taiwan. So the picture you can see is of Taipei. It's not from winter or something, it's actually smog. And they have, in Asia, there's a huge problem of smog because of a lot of factories in the north part of Taiwan, also at the southern part of China. So with the wind, sometimes a lot of smog comes to Taiwan. So although the island is pretty small, but also it's very hilly. So there are times when these smogs get accumulated in the city, and it can lead to problems like asthma and other respiratory diseases. So we started working on this project where we looked at how we could actually use like awareness. We could create these sensors for air quality monitoring to enable people to participate in this whole action. And as you can see, this shows you the years of the design process. So we had a simple design, then we moved on gradually towards more sophisticated as well as more complicated in terms of the design part, where we could have more functionalities. So it was not just about one gas or one emission variable, but rather than something which is more complete. Then we also looked into how we could make this more accessible. So we created these repositories where people could actually just get these devices and put them together in more like a plug and play manner, so that they don't have to depend on the scientists or the engineers, but rather they have the power to do it. Then we also looked at different ways to engage people. Because when you start a project, usually, with these kind of projects, which are more research oriented, you start with researchers, or maybe in this case, you had a maker community, or particularly in this one, we have a community in Taiwan. It's called a location aware sensing system community. So it's a group of making system enthusiasts, as well as some people from decision making, who really work together. So there's this massive community who get funding from different NGOs, and they create these products, which can be used for city development. The other thing we looked into this was, we didn't want to neglect the industry, because while sometimes the motive of industry can be different, they just want to make money, but they also have resources where they can chip in with their expertise or some beneficial things, where you can integrate all this knowledge into one thing and produce something which is more interesting. So the project is still running, and over the years it has received a lot of attention from people, from the government, as well as from local community. So I will show you a map. This was back in 2015. So for the whole island, we had almost 77 stations, monitoring. So this is similar to, like, we have Environmental Protection Agency in US or anywhere. So these are the official monitoring stations. And by 22, we had more than 12,000 stations. So now all the administrative units in Taiwan are covered. Now you would be thinking, it's a huge number, and a research institute or university cannot do it by itself, and it's true. So to make sure that we covered the whole island, it was mainly by collaborating with high schools, because they had a motivation where people are all like the children who are mostly affected by air pollution. They are always, let's say they are playing outside or something. So they wanted to have some kind of a system to be informed about how the air quality is, or how the things are. Then we had a lot of NGOs, we had a lot of sports groups, let's say people who go regular hiking or running. They were also enthusiastic to have these systems where they could get data to inform them about the decisions they are making. And eventually, after like there was a lot of interest from government as well. So in 2021, it was included in the smart city initiative of Taipei City. So that was something which was really interesting, because the longevity of these projects depends on the funding. But when the stakeholders like the city, they come in, so that it's not going to end up. So instead of these devices becoming electronic waste, rather it becomes more like something which can be used by the city for a greater good. Now, when you have so much, when you have so many sensors, it means you have a lot of data as well. So while designing it, we looked into different aspects like calibrating them, making sure the data was of the highest quality. It was accepted by the government as well, who are regularly testing these devices. But we also looked at how we could create data-driven applications that were informing people. And one of the applications was we created this routing application where people could just like Google Maps, but rather it would be more like a health optimal way, where you could find the best routes you could take, which are more clean in terms of the air quality. Then we also created these chatbots. Yeah, this was way before these ChatGPT chatbots. I think it was 2017, something, where it would be like you could subscribe to the nearest node that you have in terms of the air quality, and they will send you information. For example, if you have kids and you're sending them to school, maybe you will get an alert at 7 in the morning that it's going to be smoky, so maybe you should wear masks, or reduce outdoor exercises or things like that. So it was more about how you could use this data for good. Then once you have the data, and you can do many more things. So we wanted to understand what kind of action could be taken based on this data. And we found out that a lot of schools actually wanted to implement the data into their regular information boards. And this is in Chinese, but what it says is it shows you the values which are good. It has different colors. It specify whether it's good for outdoor activities or not. And people also created these dashboards, so which was mainly done by the high school people. So the idea of this air quality monitoring was included in the curriculum, which was more like awareness purposes. And then the students were actually using the open source tools to create new things. So you could say it as like it was more like an open innovation process, where you are not building something from scratch, rather what is out there has been used by people to create more innovative stuff. Then we also looked into the cultural aspect of how these things can be integrated within the smart city context. So I'm sure you, like, if you travel to Asia, like, or like places like Taiwan, India, Indonesia, Singapore, incense burning is quite a common practice in religion. Like it's supposed to purify the environment, but also it produces a lot of pollutants. And science and religion, from my understanding, they don't go together, like very well. So if you want to tell someone that, okay, this is bad for you, the topic can change to, okay, so now you don't want me to practice my religion, or it can go in either direction. So how, because in Taiwan also, it's a massive thing. So the way we wanted to do it was not doing it directly by saying, okay, you need to stop it, but rather include the people who are responsible for these places and tell them, okay, these are the things, maybe you take it, test it, and once you are aware it, then we'll have the discussion. And the same thing happened. And the Longshan temple example that is shown here is one of the biggest temples in Taipei. So if you ever go there, you will probably, now it looks different. It used to look like everyone burning incense sticks. It's still at a very small scale. There's only one temple that decided. There are several temples, but I would say this is still a good step towards making sure that like neither like the citizen nor the community feel they are forced to do something, but rather they feel included in these decisions. Now, because I was still interested, when I moved to Zurich, I started looking into the whole ecosystem, the monitoring ecosystem that is there in Switzerland. And the map you see here is of the official battery running low. Sorry. Battery. Yeah. Oh. It can still work, I think. Yeah, it's about the actual stations that are there in Switzerland, and it can be surprising or maybe not, but there are 16 official stations, for the whole country. And if you look at the map, the urban context here, there are only two, one in Lugano and one in Zurich Kaserne. Kaserne is the park that we crossed last night, when we were going to the restaurant. And for me, what I was thinking was, when a lot of people are living in urban areas, why don't we have these devices which are monitoring it in the urban areas? Rather, we have devices around Jungfrau Joch or Rigi, which is also important, if you want to monitor ozone or things like that. But again, like this reminded me of the saying that you can't change something that you can't see. So we started looking more into this thing, and we proposed a framework which is called SOCIoT framework, which is social, open source, and citizen-centric framework. So we created this program which could measure temperature, humidity, pressure, light intensity, different gases, different particulate matter, and noise. And we created this open source framework where people could actually look into how the data was being generated, how it was being integrated. And we also made sure that we were not taking any sensitive data, which in this case could have been location data, because GPS data, it can be easily used to track down people or places. Plus, we also created some applications where if you are using these resources, you don't have to depend on a data scientist per se, like for doing the analysis. So if you have little knowledge about how things work with data, there are these no-code applications that we have created where you can simply upload your data, you can do the pre-processing, outlier detection, include your contextual insights, and as well as share the data in terms of reports or something with people. And based on that, we started this Know the Air You Breathe initiative here in Zurich in cooperation with the Citizen Science Center. So we started with several phases. We started with the co-creation phase, where we asked stakeholders, so there were residents, there were people from companies, some from the city of Zurich who came around as well. And then we used our devices, like this is how the devices look like for crowdsourcing data. And then we had several workshops and sessions over which we shared knowledge, like what we understood from the data and what kind of measures people could take. So in this particular scenario, we were looking at how indoor air quality varies. And for example, during COVID, a lot of people were spending their time at home. And usually we spend a lot of time indoors, like 90%, you can say home or office, it's still indoors. And it does affect your motivation to work, your health. There are a lot of studies that have looked into it. But our main idea was to create a shared understanding of these situations, to understand how the interactions and different perspectives of different stakeholders can be taken into consideration. How can we create knowledge and share knowledge in a more inclusive manner? And how can we make sure that these things have a greater impact and wider reach? We also looked into like how we move from data intelligence towards civic intelligence here. So the idea was to focus on like how, if we use ethical tools or we use open source tools, how can we promote more interaction that can lead towards more collective intelligence? And what we figured out was that it's not just about increasing or improving the use of technology, but rather, if we really want to improve digital literacy, we have to focus on the accessibility of technology as well as the openness of this technology. Within this whole idea of accessibility as well as participation, we also looked at like how can we promote active participation. So some of the key points here were we wanted to look into the idea of community mapping, where in the initial parts of the participatory processes, you map the key actors and you understand the structural relationships, which can be cooperation, influence, or disagreement, because that is very important in these co-creation activities, where usually if there is someone who belongs to, let's say, like from the decision maker fraternity or somewhere else, they can have a higher power and they can overpower the whole conversation or discussion. So we wanted to make sure that before the discussion actually starts, there is a way to address the internal conflicts as well as the power issues. And there is a way to give feedback as well as share knowledge at the end of this participatory process. We try to include the similar idea into the air quality initiative that we were doing. And when we have so much data, how can we use the citizen generated data as evidence, which can be used for policies? So we came up with this evidence co-creation framework. It's still more like a methodological framework. We haven't implemented this thing, but this has been based on a review which we did for like almost 40 projects in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, to look at how these citizen science projects or the smart city initiatives are actually looked at. And we came up with these 4 key steps, where the first step is about mapping, where you identify the problems, you understand the key stakeholder, who the key stakeholders are, and you do the empathy mapping. Then we come to the second part, which is more about the data here. Like, how do you calibrate these data sets? How do you acquire the data? Like, what are the key regulations that are being followed? And we talk about data ownership. Like, who owns the data? What are the rights of the people who actually collect this data? Then the next part is more about data analysis, like contextualizing the data, because once you have the context, you can actually learn more from it. And the last part is about sharing, which is usually done with open data portals, visualization tools, and having some feedback mechanisms that again goes back to this feedback process. So while we have been working towards this thing, it is still not like done. There is still a lot of things we can actually do, and we can work towards creating more inclusive and ethically designed societies. And to conclude, I would say, like, the way ahead, the way I see it, is like, how can we really answer these questions? Like, what if citizens design smart cities? I know it still sounds like it's a very it's a big vision where people can actually design it, but there is progress. Even in our team, we are working about like how to address this from different viewpoints. Then we are also looking into how we can democratize data, like how we can discuss the importance of open data as well as access to open data. And then how can we improve the digital divide? How can we make sure that it reduces, and there is a chance for everyone to use these digital technologies in a sense where they feel empowered by it, not burdened by it. And how can we make sure that we don't focus just on the efficiency, but rather also on the ethical aspects? The last part is more about collaboration and not competition. Like, we should rather strive towards a collaborative approach, even if it's a competition. I say it's more like a friendly competition, like Dirk has proposed, the Climate City Cups, but not like pushing each other and going ahead. And yes, that would be it. So thank you.
Yeah, we still have some minutes for questions. Yes.
Thank you. Super impressive work you've been doing. The scale that you've managed to achieve in Taipei and in Taiwan is absolutely dumbfounding, absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
I have one question, and I wonder where it comes in, or whether it comes in, and it concerns what you term collective intelligence or the wisdom of the crowds. And we turn it around, and let's talk a little bit about collective stupidity. Just to be a bit provocative here. So democratizing data, producing open data, giving everybody access sounds very beautiful, and everybody can contribute, and everybody has a say in what could be or should be done. I love the idea in principle. But I wonder, at what stages would you think does red teaming need to come in? In other words, where do we need to start trying how we can mess up society with the data that we've generously, openly provided to everyone? Because if it can be done, it will be done. In other words, there will be malicious actors that will make use of open data. We've seen it in so many humanitarian projects, right?
Yes.
For example, PAC report. PAC report, do you remember it?
I have heard about it, yes.
Yeah, so it was used to target humanitarians and shooting them in Pakistan while they were trying to help. And it was Taliban specifically was behind it. So it was built on this very beautiful idea of Ubuntu, open data, etc., and it backfired drastically, right? And the humanitarian community has really kind of evolved to integrate what they term responsible data. In other words, they make sure that all the open data that they share is does not have negative side effects.
Yes.
They categorize concepts such as, what is sensitive data, what is not.
Mhm.
I still don't agree with them. I think that it's nonsense. There is no such thing as data categories that are objective.
Mhm.
It depends very much on the context, whether, you mentioned yourself, location data
Yeah.
can be sensitive, cannot be sensitive,
Cannot be,
or
yes.
can be necessary, right?
Yes.
If I'm in an earthquake, I want people to know where I am.
Yes. Yes.
So they can drag me out of the rubble. If
Yeah.
I'm in a political conflict, I don't want them to know where I am.
Yeah.
Right? So, but where does this red teaming come in, and
Yeah.
in which stages?
Yes, I think it's a very appropriate question for this talk, as well as something which, like, I have been looking into, and I know a lot of researchers, not just researchers, everyone is looking into, because it has massive consequences, like depending on which side it goes to. Like, strictly speaking, from the projects that I've been involved in, like from those terms. So we had these cases where, for example, like if you have a factory, so there are certain levels of emissions that you have to control. So we had these cases where people would take these devices because now it's accepted by the city. So, it's authentic, which is going to be accepted. So they started messing up with the data just to show that their levels are within the threshold, and they are like, they will get 5 stars. Okay, they are environment friendly thing. But then there are different ways to verify it. So I couldn't go much deeper. So we created this framework. It's called anomaly detection framework, which is a spatio-temporal framework that doesn't just look into the data, that also looks into the nearby activities. So for example, if there's a fire and suddenly your data is shooting up, so we don't say it's an outlier, but rather we try to understand what's the context, what's going on behind it. And in a case where someone is trying to fool you, showing this data, we can actually try to figure out whether it's true or not. But there are still possibilities where people can play around. So I feel like there is a distinction here where we have to decide what should we do with the data or what we shouldn't do with it. Like, there should be some possibilities, like, how to explain it, that a part of this data can be used for things which are more open. Let's say for awareness purposes or for decision making at a smaller scale, it's fine. But when we know that there are chances where it can be used for malicious purposes, I think there we have to create this line to understand, okay, what can you say that is based on this data? Where can you actually use it as an evidence, and where you actually cannot use it as an evidence? So that is something I feel could be looked into. I'm sure, like, if people are looking into, but it's a very difficult question. Like, I have my concerns as well, like you have, like what people can actually do with this data. But I think it puts you into this dilemma that you want to work with open data, but then you're also concerned with the negative effects. But like a coin, like two sides. Yeah, we have to consider it and then figure out ways to how to do it. Yeah.
There was already a platform. I think Peter was before. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I'll keep it short. When you mentioned the stakeholder part at the beginning, I'm not quite sure because I can overarching framework for different ideas to now present or giving us the narrative to get started. If it was first, then I would think that the historical background of the theory is interesting to see that it was proposed, the relaunch, you mentioned previous rates, the relaunch in 1984 with agreement was introduced as replacement of shareholder management. So that's the basic idea, that a shareholder, singular shareholder focus is not what helps us. And this from business, the field of business was management theory actually. And that we need to open up with the stakeholder approach, where you then borrow the term. So what I wanted to suggest is, if you keep this in mind, the monetary focus for a more complex focus, integrating different views and stakeholders, the allegory of the beehive then is tempting. However, in stakeholder theory, usually you still have the center stage. You still have the center stage, depending on on the mapping of the stakeholders. So just as a food for thought, that this would be interesting if you follow closer on the stakeholder theory. You would add Freeman, it would be the firm at the center. There are different ways to theorize it. There are different entities at the center. So just to make it think about the center stage of the stakeholders, or if it's just fluid, fluid floating entities and stakeholders.
Yeah, well, thank you for this point, because exactly like my idea was to just create a narrative to start in a way, okay, like keep it light and just to use a metaphor. But I totally agree, because I did read about some, not a lot, but like some things about like how this term was used and borrowed like in the business side of the community. And I'm sure there are, I do really want to look into the stakeholder aspect, because I think from my understanding, the smart city part, or even this citizen science or co-creation part, it largely depends on stakeholders. And so this whole space, like it's quite complex, but still it makes sense to understand it before we move ahead. So yeah, thanks for the pointers. Yeah.
So, yeah, please.
Yeah.
Okay. You brought the example of people that were tampering their data, environmental data.
Yeah.
So my question is, doesn't the creation and open access of data create also a sort of arm race, where you find that they're tampering the data, you find a way to solve that by looking at other people's data, but they could then, for example, make sure that everyone tampers the data, and you go on like this. So does the co-creation and open access of data should it be absolute, or should it be restrained somehow? For example, for certain parameters, I don't know, environmental one cannot be tampered. You cannot have access to it.
Yes, so I think it again depends on what you're monitoring. Like the point you mentioned is true, and it can happen in different cases. But again, I think it depends. For example, let's say you are building a software and you have open access code, and there are some people with malicious intents and they want to hack the code and do something to make it bad, or to get sensitive information. So in this case, I think these regulations, like which comes with this kind of data, they should be specific based on the application part. Actually, for the environmental data, I forgot to mention earlier when you asked, there is a problem with the whole Internet of Things thing, that there is no universal standardization. And when I say universal standardization, it means, for example, like every company, or like they have to follow these certain standards, which, adhere to practices about data security and privacy. So like, that these sensors, they can be manufactured super cheaply. There can be a small industry in some remote village in India where they are fabricating these sensors, but what's going behind these is not known. And this is one of the concerns. And the IoT community, I would say, because I belong to that, there's a massive research focus on how we can have these universal global standards, which are acceptable, but which are also ethical in a way that prevent the things that you're mentioning are happening. But restraining the process, I think it can also have negative impacts on this, because the idea of co-creation is bringing people together and doing the things together. And from my understanding, opening up data or opening up the software or the code somehow promotes the trust which is needed for these kind of activities. So if you are already cutting this part out, that kind of leads to these kind of questions, which would influence or impact people's participation. And that will again send us to the point one, that if you cannot bridge this gap between these stakeholders, how can you actually move ahead? So I would say, rather than just having these control things on that, maybe there are other ways where you can have better approaches. But yeah, I personally haven't really been haven't looked into those directions, but these are definitely potential research areas.
Yeah. We can move the discussion to the coffee break.
So you started your presentation out with the table of business, and right, it's 300 years old.
Yes.
And it's good to illustrate basically how social systems can work for social functionality can come about by that optimization. Things can work. Actually, it's even more surprising than you presented, because the B just lays eggs. It does not give any commands to the beehive. That's number one. Number two, swarm intelligence, of course, is fascinating, but humans are not bees, right? They're a lot more intelligent, have a lot more capabilities, and that's why we discuss a lot about collective intelligence as a generalization of swarm intelligence. And as Andre has rightly pointed out, if you don't have the right interaction mechanisms in place, we can end up with a madness of crowd. And that happens in particular if people are manipulated in their information search, which is basically the case all the time now, in times of personalization of information, targeting, all of this. So it kind of, this creates the madness. And we need to have different kind of mechanisms in order to allow collective intelligence to strike. Maybe that is not intended by those who are performing the platform, right?
Yes.
Because information asymmetry creates power and make people dumb. Is a way to increase information asymmetry and thereby power. But anyway, so we need to think that people of bees into the 21st century in a way that makes it appealing for the future of science. So we need to upgrade that narrative, indicating how digital technology would allow us to go beyond swarm intelligence, beyond bureaucratic times, to have something which is also better than this idea of the benevolent dictator that has all the data at disposal and tries to do the best thing for everyone, which we don't believe in. And so you've shown some very nice examples of how co-creation can benefit societies. Now it would be interesting to kind of formalize those mechanisms more to make clear how to use digital technology such that this collective intelligence, I don't know, 5.0 will come about.
That is definitely probably the next step to do, because that would make it more interesting and more applicable, in terms of how we can actually go ahead and use it in real world environments. And about the bee thing, actually, when I was working on the slides, I had these two. The other alternative I was thinking was using the example of an orchestra, where you have people, everyone is having their own instruments, but if they just start playing randomly, it's noise, but if they are playing together, it's a symphony. So but then I like bees more, so I was like, okay, let's go with the bees this time. But yeah, noted. Thank you.